It was a quiet morning in the small town of Riverview. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with soft pink and orange colors. Birds chirped in the trees, and a cool breeze blew through the streets. The town was peaceful, with only a few people outside starting their day. Emily Dawson, a kind and gentle woman in her mid-30s, walked slowly down Main Street. She wore her usual light blue jacket and dark jeans, her brown hair tied neatly in a ponytail. Emily's eyes, though clouded with blindness, held a quiet strength. She couldn't see the beauty around her, but she could feel it: the warmth of the sun on her face, the rustle of leaves, and the steady click of her guide dog's paws on the pavement. Max, her loyal golden retriever, walked confidently by her side. He was more than just a dog to Emily. He was her eyes, her protector, and her best friend. Every morning, they followed the same path past the little bakery where the smell of fresh bread filled the air, past the park where children laughed and played, and past Mr. Thompson's bookstore, where the old man would always wave and say, "Good morning, Emily," even though she couldn't see him. To most people in town, Emily seemed like an ordinary woman, just someone who had to work a little harder to get through life because she couldn't see. Many admired her for her independence and strength, but some people didn't understand. Some whispered behind her back, thinking she was helpless and weak. They didn't know the truth about Emily. They didn't know what she was truly capable of. Because appearances can be deceiving. Emily had learned to live with people's assumptions. She knew that when they saw her walking with Max, they thought she was fragile and needed protection. What they didn't know was that Emily had a secret. And Max? Well, he wasn't just a guide dog. He was something much more. As they walked, Emily's fingers lightly brushed Max's harness. She trusted him completely. Max wasn't just trained to help her cross streets or guide her around obstacles. He was trained for something far greater. Something no one in Riverview would ever expect. As they passed by the coffee shop, Emily heard a group of teenagers laughing. One of them, a boy with a loud voice, whispered, "Look, it's the blind lady and her dog again. She's always walking alone." Emily's ears caught the words, but she pretended not to hear. She had faced comments like that before. But today, she just smiled to herself and kept walking. Max's ears twitched, sensing Emily's feelings. He looked up at her with his deep brown eyes as if to say, "I've got you." Emily gave his harness a gentle squeeze. She knew Max was always watching, always ready. She walked past the hardware store where Mr. Sanders was unloading boxes. "Morning, Emily," he called out. "Need any help today?" Emily shook her head with a warm smile. "No, thank you, Mr. Sanders. Max and I are doing just fine." She didn't mind when people offered help, but she wished they could see her as more than just a blind woman. She was strong. She was prepared. And Max was trained to do more than anyone could imagine. What the people of Riverview didn't know was that Emily had spent years training with Max in secret. Not just for guiding, but for defense. Max was a tactical defense canine, trained to protect her from danger. If someone tried to hurt her, they would quickly realize their mistake. Max could sense danger before it even happened. He was trained to listen for unusual sounds, watch for sudden movements, and protect Emily at all costs. And though Emily seemed harmless, she knew how to give Max commands that could turn him from a gentle guide into a powerful protector in seconds. As they reached the end of Main Street, Emily stopped at the crosswalk. She listened carefully to the sounds of cars passing by. Max stood still, waiting for her signal. A few moments passed, and when it was safe, Emily whispered, "Forward," and Max led her across the street with ease. Most people didn't realize how much trust it took to let a dog lead you across a busy street. But Emily trusted Max more than anything. He was her lifeline, her safety, her world. As she walked past the quiet neighborhood streets, Emily thought about how much her life had changed since Max came into it. Before Max, she had felt vulnerable and unsure of herself. But now, she felt strong. She felt safe. With Max, she wasn't just a blind woman, she was someone who could take care of herself. The town of Riverview had no idea about the secret strength Emily carried with her every day. They saw a woman with a disability. But in reality, Emily and Max were a team like no other. Together, they were unstoppable. And today, they would prove it. Because Riverview was quiet and peaceful, but not everyone in town was kind. There were people who didn't understand kindness, people who liked to take advantage of others. Emily knew this all too well. She had overheard enough conversations to know that not everyone believed she belonged on her own. But Emily didn't need anyone's approval. She smiled as she and Max made their way toward the park. The trees rustled in the wind, and children's laughter filled the air. It was one of her favorite spots in town. But little did she know, today would not be like every other day. Today, something unexpected was going to happen. And Emily and Max were ready for it. As they reached the park bench, Emily sat down and let Max rest beside her. She ran her hand through his soft fur, feeling the strength and comfort he gave her. No matter what happened, Emily knew one thing for sure: Max would always be by her side. Because Max wasn't just a guide dog. He was a protector. And today, someone in Riverview was about to find out just how much. The quiet, peaceful morning in Riverview suddenly changed. The air, once filled with birds singing and the soft rustling of leaves, was now filled with a loud, deep rumble. A group of bikers roared into the parking lot of Joe's Diner, their motorcycles growling like wild animals. The sound echoed down Main Street, making a few people glance up in surprise. The bikers parked their shiny black motorcycles in a messy row, kicking up dust as they stopped. They wore heavy leather jackets, dark sunglasses, and thick boots that clunked against the pavement. Their loud laughter filled the air, rough and mean, as they swaggered around the diner like they owned the place. Emily, who had been walking quietly down the sidewalk with Max by her side, heard the loud engines and stopped for a moment. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. Crowds and loud noises weren't her favorite things, but she wasn't afraid. She had Max, and that was all she needed. As Emily and Max reached the crosswalk, one of the bikers, a big man with a scruffy beard and a long scar down his arm, nudged his friend. His voice was loud and mocking. "Look at her," he sneered, just loud enough for Emily to hear. "Helpless and clueless. Bet she wouldn't even notice if we took that mutt of hers." His friends laughed, their voices rough and cruel. Another biker, a tall one with tattoos covering his arms, grinned and said, "Yeah, easy target. Blind and all alone. Too bad for her." Emily's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let it show. Her grip on Max's harness tightened. She could feel the tension in Max's body, his muscles firm and ready. He sensed the danger, just like she did. Max let out a low growl, so quiet that only Emily could hear it. She gently placed her hand on his head, calming him. She'd met people like this before, people who thought she was weak just because she couldn't see. They didn't know the truth. They didn't know who she really was, or what Max could do. The bikers didn't stop. They kept talking, their voices dripping with arrogance. One of them revved his motorcycle engine, making it roar loudly, trying to startle Emily. But she didn't flinch. She stood tall, her chin lifted slightly. "Hey, lady!" Another biker called out. "Need some help crossing the street? Don't worry, we can lead you wherever you want." His friends burst into laughter again. Emily remained calm, but inside, she felt a flicker of anger. She had been through this before, people assuming she needed their help, thinking she was weak. She wasn't. And she wouldn't let them scare her. She took a deep breath and stepped forward confidently. "I don't need any help," she said in a clear voice, her hand firmly on Max's harness. "We're just fine on our own." The biker with the scar chuckled. "Oh, you're tough, huh? Let's see how tough you are without that dog." He took a step closer, his heavy boots clunking on the pavement. Max's ears perked up, and Emily could feel the tension in his body growing stronger. She knew Max was ready. He wasn't just a guide dog, he was her protector. And he wouldn't let anyone harm her. The bikers didn't realize who they were dealing with. They didn't know that Max had been trained to defend and protect. They thought they were picking on a helpless blind woman, but they were making a big mistake. The leader of the group, a bald man with a thick chain around his neck, watched Emily closely. His eyes narrowed. "Come on, lady. We're just having a little fun," he said with a smirk. Emily didn't say anything. She just kept walking, Max leading the way with steady, confident steps. But as she passed by, she heard the bikers whispering and laughing behind her. One of them muttered, "I bet she'd be real scared if Max wasn't around." Emily clenched her jaw, but she didn't turn around. She knew better than to engage with people like them. She had faced bullies before, and she knew the best way to deal with them was to stay strong and not show fear. But inside, she was ready. If they tried anything, Max would be prepared. As she continued walking, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. The bikers were following her. Emily's heart pounded, but she kept her cool. She whispered softly to Max, "Stay alert, boy." Max responded by walking a little closer to her side, his body tense, his eyes scanning the area. His tail, usually wagging happily, was now still. Emily knew she had to get to a safer place. She couldn't see them, but she could hear their heavy boots, their low chuckles. They were getting closer. Just then, a familiar voice called out from across the street. "Emily! Is that you?" It was Mrs. Johnson, the friendly bakery owner. Emily smiled with relief. "Yes, it's me," she called back. Mrs. Johnson hurried over, her footsteps quick and light. "It's good to see you, dear. Are you all right?" Emily nodded, grateful for the interruption. "Yes, Max and I were just taking our morning walk." The bikers, now seeing that Emily wasn't alone, mumbled among themselves and backed off a little. One of them muttered something under his breath, and they walked back toward their motorcycles. Emily sighed in relief but kept her posture strong. "Thanks, Mrs. Johnson," she said softly. Mrs. Johnson smiled. "Anytime, dear. Those men have no right to bother you." Emily gave Max a gentle pat, whispering, "Good boy." She could feel the steady thump of his tail against her leg. As she and Max walked away, the bikers revved their engines once more, but this time, they didn't say anything. They just watched as Emily and Max disappeared down the sidewalk. Little did they know, they had just met someone stronger than they could ever imagine. And if they ever tried anything again, they would find out exactly what Max was capable of. Emily walked on, her head held high. She knew there would always be people who didn't understand, but that was okay. Because she had Max. And with him by her side, she was never truly alone. Max could feel Emily's heartbeat through the grip of her hand on his harness. He didn't need to see the bikers or hear their words to know something wasn't right. His ears twitched, his muscles stiffened, and his tail stopped wagging. He stood tall, his eyes scanning the area. He was trained for moments like this. Emily felt the change in Max right away. She took a deep breath and whispered softly under her breath, "Easy, Max. Just stay with me." Her voice was calm, but inside, she felt nervous. These men weren't just joking around. There was something mean in their voices, something that made her feel uneasy. The bikers got closer, their heavy boots crunching against the gravel. One of them, the man with the scruffy beard, smirked as he stepped toward Emily. His friends stood behind him, watching with grins on their faces. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with amusement. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" He reached out slowly, pretending to grab Max's leash. Before his hand could even get close, Max sprang into action. With a sharp, commanding bark, Max lunged forward, planting his paws firmly on the ground. His bark wasn't just loud, it was powerful. It wasn't the bark of an ordinary dog. It was the bark of a trained protector, full of warning and control. The biker's hand shot back, his grin vanishing. Whoa, what the? He stumbled back, his eyes wide with surprise. His friends, who had been laughing a moment ago, fell silent. One of them chuckled nervously. Looks like the dog doesn't like you, Tony, he said, trying to make a joke, but there was a hint of nervousness in his voice. Max didn't move. His body was tense, his eyes locked onto the group, ready for anything. His fur bristled slightly, and his deep brown eyes stayed fixed on the man in front of him. Emily could feel the strength in his stance through the leash. Emily's heart pounded, but her voice was steady and calm. She spoke softly but firmly. Max, stand down for now. At her words, Max slowly relaxed, but he didn't take his eyes off the bikers. His muscles were still tight, ready to act if needed. Emily gave the harness a small squeeze to let him know she was in control. The scruffy biker, Tony, forced a laugh and stepped back. Just a little joke, lady, he said, trying to sound tough, but there was a nervous edge to his voice. He looked at his friends, expecting them to laugh, but they were still staring at Max, unsure of what to say. Emily stood tall, her face calm. She had been through moments like this before. People often thought she was weak because she couldn't see. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know about Max and what he was trained to do. One of the bikers, a tall man with sunglasses, nudged Tony. Come on, man, leave her alone, he muttered. Let's just go. Tony scowled but didn't argue. He took a few steps back, pretending he wasn't bothered, but his hands were shaking slightly. Yeah, whatever, he grumbled. Let's get out of here. The group turned away, walking toward their motorcycles, muttering among themselves. They tried to laugh it off, but Emily could hear the nervousness in their voices. They weren't so sure of themselves anymore. As they walked away, Emily gently ran her fingers through Max's fur. Good boy, she whispered with a small smile. Max wagged his tail just a little, but he stayed alert, watching the bikers until they were out of sight. Emily took a deep breath and continued walking, her grip on Max's harness still firm but more relaxed. She could feel the stares of a few people around her. Some had watched the whole thing unfold. She didn't need their pity or their concern. She had Max, and that was enough. As they moved down the sidewalk, Emily thought about what had just happened. She knew the bikers had underestimated her. They thought she was just a blind woman with a dog. They didn't know Max wasn't just any guide dog, he was a trained defense canine. Emily had spent years working with him, learning how to command him in dangerous situations. Max could sense danger before it even arrived. He could listen to the change in a person's voice, notice their body language, and react in a split second. Most people would never guess that a guide dog could do so much more than lead his owner down the street. Emily remembered the day she first met Max. She had been scared, unsure of herself. But as soon as she held his harness and walked with him, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: confidence. And now, moments like this reminded her of just how special he was. As they walked, Emily heard the distant roar of the motorcycles fading away. She hoped the bikers had learned their lesson that they couldn't judge people by how they looked. She smiled to herself, feeling proud of Max and a little proud of herself too. She didn't need to fight or argue with the bikers. She just had to trust Max, and he had handled it perfectly. Let's go home, Max, she said softly. Max gave a happy wag of his tail and led her down the familiar path toward their house. As they walked past the diner, Mrs. Johnson, the friendly old woman who ran the bakery, waved at Emily. You okay, dear? She asked, concern in her voice. Emily smiled. I'm fine, Mrs. Johnson. Max took care of it. Mrs. Johnson chuckled. I bet he did. That dog is something special. Emily nodded, running her hand over Max's back. He sure is. With each step they took, Emily felt stronger. She knew there would always be people who didn't understand, who thought she was weak or helpless. But they didn't know the truth. She wasn't afraid. And with Max by her side, she never would be. As they walked down the street, the town returned to its usual calm. The sun was shining, and the breeze was gentle again. Emily smiled as she listened to the sounds around her, kids laughing in the park, the hum of passing cars, and the steady, comforting sound of Max's paws on the pavement. She knew that life would always have challenges. But as long as she had Max, she could face anything that came her way. One of the bikers, a tall man with dark sunglasses and a thick black leather jacket, stepped forward, clearly annoyed. His heavy boots hit the pavement with a loud thud as he moved closer to Emily and Max. He clenched his fists and scowled, looking down at the golden retriever standing firmly in front of Emily. "You think your dog scares us?" he growled, his voice low and threatening. His friends laughed behind him, their voices loud and mocking. They thought it was all a joke. Emily didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, her expression calm and composed. Her voice was steady but sharp as she spoke, cutting through their laughter like a knife. "Max isn't just a guide dog," she said firmly. "He's trained to protect me. I suggest you don't test him." The biker snorted, shaking his head. "Oh yeah," he said, taking another step forward. "We're not scared of some fluffy little dog." His friends chuckled, but the laughter didn't last long. Before anyone could react, Max lunged forward with lightning speed. His movements were quick, precise, and powerful. In one smooth motion, he knocked a crowbar out of the hands of one of the bikers, sending it clattering to the ground. The sharp sound echoed through the street. The man who had been holding the crowbar stumbled back, his face frozen in shock. His cocky grin was gone, replaced by wide eyes and an open mouth. "What the?" he stuttered, staring at Max, who now stood firmly between Emily and the group of men. Max's eyes locked onto the bikers. His body was tense, his stance strong. He let out a deep, low growl that sent shivers down their spines. This wasn't the bark of an ordinary dog. This was the sound of a trained protector, a dog who knew exactly what he was doing. Emily stood behind Max, completely calm. She didn't look scared or worried. She didn't even take a step back. She simply crossed her arms and said in a cool, clear voice, "Max is a tactical defense canine. He's trained to neutralize threats. You've made your point. Now leave." The bikers were frozen in place, their faces showing a mix of confusion and fear. This wasn't what they had expected. They thought Emily was just a helpless blind woman with a dog. They never imagined the dog could actually defend her. The leader of the group, the one who had been so confident before, hesitated. He looked at his friends, then back at Max, who hadn't moved an inch. The dog's eyes stayed fixed on them, his muscles still tight and ready. Finally, the leader swallowed hard and muttered under his breath, "Let's get out of here." He turned quickly and walked back toward his motorcycle. One by one, the other bikers followed, their laughter gone. They didn't look back. They didn't want to mess with Emily or Max again. Emily stood still, listening to the sound of their footsteps fading away. She reached down and patted Max gently on the head. "Good boy," she whispered with a small smile. Max wagged his tail slightly but kept his eyes on the bikers until they were completely gone. Mrs. Johnson, the bakery owner who had been watching from the window, rushed outside. Her face was full of worry and amazement. "Emily, are you okay?" she asked, her voice shaking slightly. Emily nodded. "I'm fine, Mrs. Johnson. Max took care of everything." Mrs. Johnson looked down at Max in awe. "I had no idea he could do that. I thought he was just a guide dog." Emily smiled softly. "He's much more than that. He's my protector." A small crowd had gathered nearby, people whispering and pointing at Max. They had never seen anything like this before. Some of them had thought Emily was weak, but now they saw her in a completely different way. "Mr. Thompson, the bookstore owner, stepped forward. "That was incredible," he said. "That dog of yours is something special." Emily nodded proudly. "Yes, he is." As she and Max continued their walk, she could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her. She didn't mind. She was used to people making assumptions about her, but today they had learned something important. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't weak. She was strong, and with Max by her side, she could take care of herself. As they walked down the quiet street, Emily thought about how grateful she was for Max. He wasn't just a dog, he was her partner, her protector, and her best friend. With him by her side, she knew she could handle anything that came her way. She smiled as she spoke softly to Max. "Come on, boy. Let's go home." Max wagged his tail and walked proudly beside her, his head held high. Emily might not have been able to see, but she could feel the confidence in Max's stride. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt truly safe. The bikers scrambled onto their motorcycles, their hands shaking as they fumbled with their keys. Their once proud and confident grins were gone, replaced by looks of shock and embarrassment. The loud roar of their engines filled the street, but it no longer felt powerful. It sounded more like they were running away, escaping from something they never expected. As they sped off down the road, their tires screeched, leaving behind faint trails of dust. Emily stood in the same spot, her fingers resting gently on Max's harness. Her heart was still beating fast, but she didn't let it show. She stood tall, her expression calm and steady, just like Max. Max remained alert, his eyes following the disappearing motorcycles until they were completely out of sight. Then, slowly, he relaxed. Emily felt his body ease, and she gave him a soft pat on the head. "Good boy," she whispered. Max wagged his tail gently, his ears still perked up, making sure everything was safe. Around them, the town had fallen silent. The people who had gathered to watch stood frozen, their mouths open in amazement. No one had expected this. They had seen Emily walking these streets every day, but today was different. Today, they saw a side of her they had never imagined. Then, suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of applause. It started with one person clapping slowly, then another, and soon the whole crowd joined in. The sound grew louder, and a warm feeling spread through Emily's chest. She hadn't done it for attention, but it felt good to know that people saw her and Max for who they really were, not weak, not helpless, but strong and capable. A young girl, about 10 years old, stepped forward. She had blonde pigtails and wore a bright pink jacket. She looked up at Emily with wide eyes full of admiration. "Your dog is amazing," she said softly, her voice filled with wonder. Emily knelt down and smiled gently at the little girl. "He's more than amazing," she said, stroking Max's golden fur. "He's my partner." The girl's eyes lit up, and she reached out a hand to pet Max. Emily nodded, and Max stood still, letting the girl gently touch his head. "He's so soft," the girl whispered, giggling as Max licked her fingers. Mrs. Johnson, the kind lady from the bakery, stepped forward next. She placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "That was something else, dear," she said warmly. "I've always known you were strong, but today, you showed everyone just how strong." Emily smiled and nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson," she said. "I just wanted them to know that I can take care of myself." Mr. Thompson, the bookstore owner, walked over, adjusting his glasses. "Well, I don't think anyone will doubt that again," he said with a chuckle. "You and Max make quite the team." Emily felt a deep sense of pride, not just in Max but in herself too. She had always believed that she could be independent, but today she had proved it not just to the town, but to herself. One by one, people from the crowd came up to talk to her. Some of them apologized for underestimating her, while others simply wanted to say how impressed they were. Emily accepted their kind words with a grateful smile, feeling stronger with each passing moment. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, Emily took a deep breath. She could still feel the tension from earlier, but it was fading now, replaced by relief. Max nuzzled against her leg, his warm presence reminding her that she was never alone. A man from the local newspaper approached with a camera. "Emily, would you mind if I took a picture?" he asked. "I think the whole town needs to hear your story." Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure," she said. She stood up straight, holding onto Max's harness, and smiled for the camera. The flash went off, and she heard the click of the shutter. The reporter grinned. "Thanks, Emily. You and Max are real heroes today." Heroes. The word made Emily smile. She didn't feel like a hero. She just felt like herself, someone who had faced a tough moment and come out stronger because of it. As she and Max continued their walk home, Emily felt lighter. The sun was shining brightly now, and the world felt a little safer.